Hola amigos, bienvenidos a .NET API Review. Uh, Tenemos almost a screen worth of stuff, but we have some meaty things, so we're not going to make much progress over the next couple of weeks. But I'm hoping today we'll knock out 4. So let's get started. First up is .NET Extensions 7254, Function Approvals and MCP Abstractions. Whoever wants to go, you're up.
Yep. Yep. Okay, so this proposal contains is you could say it's two proposals, but I'll try to give a little bit of context for this. Um, so this is about adding a bunch of contents, AI contents, um, for handling input interactions when requested by a service. Um, it also adds the tools necessary for enabling these interactions, and also as utilities for tuning the tools. I think the way I articulated this is to put first the most base types on the contents, and then we can move to the tools and then to the tool utilities. And for this, I'll just start by describing the the contents. Um, Well, I'll have a few more notes here. These APIs here um, are experimental right now, so they are already shipping. So what we're trying to achieve here is vet the APIs, and hopefully with whatever suggestion we have of the approval, we can remove the experimental attributes on them. We also have a few PRs on the fly that modify some of the contents here, which are part of the proposal. Um, okay, with that, I'll try to explain the input contents. These basically are meant to represent, well, there's the need to um, to allow to have a content to represent um, when an input is requested, and also how to respond to that. So we have this base type, which is input request content. And it's what's backing the scenario that we're currently supporting, which is the function approval content. Um, this function approval content is a yes or no answer, but you could have in the future some other scenarios which are beyond that. It could be like any kind of input. Um, so what we have here is just an effectively sealed types exposing an ID, and these types are meant to be have the necessary attributes to be JSON polymorphic. And then what we have next on top of that is function approval contents. And for those are meant to represent how a function call. If you get a function call, you can grab. Well, it is grabbing one of these contents, and it flows to the well, most of the cases to the user, so it can respond to it. So what we have for that is they can be constructed with they can be built with a constructor um, for the request part, and the response part can either be built with a constructor or be created with a factory in the request, which is for convenience for create response, which accepts the yes or no answer, the bool, and also an optional reason. Um, so those are the two things that we are adding first, which is meant to encompass function approvals. And then the function approval infrastructure, we also have NCP contents, which are meant to represent, well, the services have a functionality. Some services have the functionality that you can point them to a URL, or some others even support some built-in IDs to built-in MCP servers. So the service does the MCP tool invocation on behalf of the client. So what we are proposing here is we are actually unsealing function call content and also adding a bool to call invocation required. And with that, we can extend function call content for represent MCP server tool content. The reason why we're doing all these changes.
I think, David, you just cut out.
Oh, whoops! Looks like I muted myself.
Yes. We can hear you now. Please go ahead.
Okay, yeah.
We heard everything up to the reason why we're doing these changes.
Okay, the reason why we change function call content is because MCP server tools are not like normal function call contents. They are informational. There is not much there is not much you can do with the object return, or it can be informed and do a decision based on that. And also, this also MCP contents are also needed because and these MCP contents are also used for approval workflows in the MCP tools, because basically the services by default require approval for tool invocation, which also is configured by the tool, but it's something that we want to enable with existing function approval types that we are providing for the local functions that we have. Can you scroll down a little bit more, Jeremy? So yeah, other required changes that we need for extending function call content is also putting the JSON polymorphic attributes on the function call content type. As I mentioned, the invocation required bool that is right below the JSON ignore exception is set as true for all the existing function call contents, but for these ones that we are adding, for the MCP tool ones, we're actually setting it to false, hence how we leverage it. Same for function result content. We also only change, as I mentioned here, this is an existing type. Only the attributes are new. Yeah, that's for the content parts. I would prefer to pause here and see if there is any questions on this front, or do you want me to continue to the tools?
Much a question, but an observation. The type values that you are using for JSON polymorphism really should be namespaced, so they are globally unique and not just a single word. So, I'd expect to see something like com.microsoft.net.ai .mcp hash request, hash response, and things like that. Having just a single word isn't really best practice.
I'm confused by that, Barry, since in this space, I don't see anyone doing that. Not just in this library, but like anywhere
if we are restricted because that's what the spec says, that you must use this type name, then fine. If these are type names that we have made up ourselves, then we ought to follow best practice.
But to what benefit? What will that actually help?
Well, if only our libraries are parsing our JSON, then it's not so bad. But if you are, if something else might take these, take the JSON in and parse it, we're just disambiguating what the types are and where people would find the definition for the types.
Yeah, none of these are intended to be any kind of standard that other things consume. It's really there to support round tripping.
Okay, fair enough then.
So proprietary, effectively, is what you're getting at.
And on the flip side, right, this means that like no one using any other software will see this. This will only show up like if you're debugging .NET apps. Or
Right.
like, I mean, I guess it does. I mean, it round trips, so it'll show up in people's logs and stuff. Would like the name spacing be helpful from like a usability perspective? Just to point out that this is some like internal, but I guess
I think it makes it harder from a usability perspective, because if you are
Yeah.
looking at it in a log, you got all this junk that you have to ignore to get to the meat.
yeah, it makes sense. And the rest of AI content is all defined by us too, right? And how it's JSON
It is,
serialized,
and
so.
is already shipped in a supported manner. So these would
Yeah.
end up being different from those.
So it'd be inconsistent. Okay, yeah, seems reasonable.
This is still not clear to me. Sorry, can you repeat, Barry? What does it the naming spacing buys us?
Well, it doesn't really matter because these are apparently internal types. So you can disregard what I said.
All right. Thank you.
So I'm confused about, I guess, most of this stuff. So like on your function approval request content, you have an instance method create response that takes a Boolean, but returns a thing that you can't see the Boolean on.
That you can. It's approved. It's a bool approved.
Where do you see that? Function
6
approval.
lines down from your cursor.
That's not in this type.
It is. Look down just below. That's response content, not request content.
Because request and response are dear computer science from like 70 years ago. Please come up with better words. All right. Yep. I thought it was returning itself. Never mind. But then on these base classes, the only useful thing is
Right.
request ID.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what to tell you. So I don't know at which extent how much does a base class needs to have to be there. Does that make sense? Like could you could have an empty base class that's still useful, right?
Yeah, I'm just like, does it make sense to have a to JSON, or I guess AI content has some stuff. So what you're saying is your AI content plus a request ID.
Yes. Correct.
Fair enough.
Remind me what happens if I have a reference of type input request content, and I serialize that using STJ. It's going to have $type function approval request emitted. It's going to have the request ID emitted, anything that's on AI content, the base class emitted, but it's not going to have it's not going to have like function call property emitted, correct? Because that's not on the base type, it's on a derived type.
I think that's what JSON polymorphic does. Is
Oh,
it
yes,
says write
okay,
the
of
derived
course.
types properties.
Yes. Okay. Yes, yes, you're right. But only if it's one of the listed types. Okay.
And then what are we? I guess my other question, if we are agreeing with this shape, I guess my questions were be more related to the function call content. If there's
So chat has asked why your pattern in this guy is everything is get only except reason.
so yeah, this property came up after type shipped. As I said before, these types are shipped as experimental. So there is some value in avoid breaking existing calls to the constructor, for example, right?
I wouldn't worry about that, David.
Yeah, I was gonna say shipping something without going through API review is telling yourself and your users that you're willing to break them.
Well, hold on a sec. We haven't done API review for a lot of stuff in the AI space because it's been moving so quickly. But the ones that we are okay breaking, we've marked as experimental, and we should,
Fair enough.
as part of removing experimental, be comfortable changing it. We want to avoid changing it every single time we ship a new build every few weeks, but getting everything to the right shape before we remove experimental is goodness.
I see. Okay, yeah. Okay, so what I'm hearing here is that, yeah, as part of removing experimental will be to actually remove the optional reason, right?
Right. So you want to move it into a defaulted constructor parameter. Or a
If that's
mandatory
the-
constructor parameter.
I would say a default constructor parameter will be fine. I might need to think a little bit more of that, but yeah, whatever we do there seems fine. Seems better than having it as optional. Define a shape.
And the property would still be nullable, right?
Yes, because it will be defaulted to null because this is optional. Any other feedback on NCP on these 1 to 6 types, the first 6 types?
I'm not hearing any.
Okay, as I mentioned, for function call content, we are unsealing that type. And also we are adding the invocation required property.
Okay. So is function call content a reviewed type or just an experimental type?
That's a review type. It's,
Okay.
Yeah.
Just
So we're doing this change for that. Just wanted to touch base on the naming of the invocation required. Seems fine to me, especially because this is, I like this name because let's say that you have the flip polarity to already handle. That wouldn't play well with the NCP tool calls because they are not really well, when you are asking for an approval for the MCP tool call, you will have the MCP server tool call content constructor with already handled true, which wouldn't be the case, or you will have to have already handled false. I would prefer to keep this like set the invocation required property in the constructor to false and then just forget about it. That's why I prefer this name. That's what I'm saying, trying to say.
Are your two states already called and not yet called, or are they required and optional?
What do you mean?
Well, it sounded to me like you're describing that the opposite of invocation required is already handled. But
No, because already handled means that there implies that there was an invocation, right? And
sure, you were saying you prefer the name invocation required over already handled, and so I'm asking what are your two states that you actually have?
I think I'm missing the question, sorry. Can you kind of rephrase?
if the alternative name for invocation required is already handled,
Mhm.
that doesn't make sense to me. So I'm trying to understand what does true mean and what does false mean in longer phrases so we can make sure we have the
Ah.
right name here.
Okay, true means that we have this piece of middleware, which is called function invoking chat client. And not only that middleware, but the user also needs to read the function call content and see if they need to do something with it, right? Invocation required true means that this function call content needs to be invocated. And when it's invocated, it needs to be set to false because it's no longer required, either by the user or by middleware.
And if it is false, is someone still allowed to invoke it?
You mean if we change to already? No. If it is false, it is not allowed to be invoked, right?
It's basically indicating whether it's something that someone needs to take action on or whether it's informative. Is there a better name that you would prefer, Jeremy?
Well, just the opposite of required is optional. So invocation required false sounds like other pieces of middleware can see it and be like, oh, I can add information on this and I'm allowed to still do stuff. If it's supposed to be pending versus handled, then that would be invocation pending. Like that's what I'm trying to
So you're
understand what the
suggesting-
states are.
You're saying the meaning is this do you need to do something in response to this, or is it informational? So you think pending is a better word?
I think pending means it's not yet invoked.
Yeah, I don't necessarily like pending because that doesn't really convey that you, the consumer, are supposed to take action.
Yeah, I mean, if people think in context required makes sense, sure. I just feel like the opposite of required is optional, not the opposite of required is prohibited.
So maybe requested instead of required.
Sorry if this has already been answered, but like, what's the scenario where the code reading the function call context might not know ahead of time whether or not it's supposed to be calling the functions or like logging it or whatever else it might be doing?
Pretty much any time code receives one, it doesn't know. So if there was a function invoking chat client in the pipeline, then it likely handled it. But if that function invoking chat client wasn't there, or if it was configured in a way that allowed it to ignore function call contents for functions that it wasn't aware of, basically all of those function call contents are emerging regardless of whether they were invoked by the function invoking chat client or not. And the consumer doesn't really know whether it's something that still requires follow-up or not. Or in a situation where you're trying to use this type to represent server-side invocations, like in the MCP case, it's effectively the same case, but the invocation was pushed further down the pipeline. So it was basically invoked on the server, and you're just getting a notification that it was already invoked, just like if you had a function invoking chat client in your pipeline, and you're basically getting an invocation, you're getting a notification that it was already invoked, not a request for you to still invoke it. So there's always been ambiguity, and we're trying to clear that up, plus enable additional scenarios that would just increase the ambiguity.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm worried about if this is high fidelity enough, because it almost sounds like in the world of like ASP.NET Core middleware, you could have like 2 endpoint middlewares and like have them like or 2 function calling middlewares. So we don't have to change it. Like we don't have to abstract this more than it already is. Like, is it really enough? What if there's a 3rd function calling middleware? Like, don't they need more coordination than just like I've already been called or not? Like if you're gonna have
what more do you think? So if, like, some of the tests for this included adding 3 function invoking chat clients into the pipeline, and once one of them invokes it, it flips the switch, and the other ones will then not try and invoke it. They'll just
Right,
ignore
but if
it.
that's all there is to it, then the first one's gonna do it every time and you don't need it. So there's clearly something more going on.
Only if the first one supports it. They can be configured to only respect certain tools.
I see.
Oh,
But
do
then
you-
I guess why forward it at all then?
Yeah.
Because consumers still want to know that function calls were requested, and they want to know what the results were to show in UI, to be aware of. In the case of something like the MCP stuff from the server, like the only reason they're being sent from the server to the client, there's no invocation on the client. It's being sent to notify you.
Okay.
But the result isn't here in the type.
It is on function result content.
I see.
Is
Function
Well,
call
could-
content is the request to invoke, and function result content is the results of that invocation.
Should the middleware just pass on the result content, which then has a reference to the call content or something as a way to indicate downstream that it's been handled? Because now you have the result attached.
We tried that. We tried to do so we tried two things. We tried one thing, which is just try and correlate them by call ID. And so if you see both, then you know that the function call was handled because you have the corresponding result. That's problematic because of situations where, especially in streaming, you don't know whether you haven't received a function result content yet because it wasn't sent, or because it just haven't got it yet. Like you basically don't know whether it was handled or not. What you're saying is the function result content, instead of including a bool, would include a reference to the original function call content. And that basically ends up possibly being duplicative in terms of information. You also possibly have reference identity issues. Or the function result content needs to go look up, like the creation of the function result content needs to go find the function call content instance in order to reference it. Which means you need to keep it around in all the processing pipeline.
Yeah, this is getting a little deeper. Yeah, then I can probably discuss it at this point. But I think I followed it mostly. That you're trying not to lose information and make it easy to implement, but still.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm still a little confused as to how this information gets forwarded, because I think, Steve, you had said that that the response gets forwarded throughout the middleware pipeline along with the request, along with the call context. Does the call context somehow carry through some level of indirections a reference to the result, or is the idea that the middleware is sending a tuple of request and response and forwarding
The function call content and the function result content are two completely separate pieces of information that are correlatable purely by call ID.
Okay. And even though the system is forwarding the two of those effectively linked together through the call ID, it doesn't make sense to carry a third piece of information linkable by that call ID that says, hey, this request has already been processed, and by the way, here's a response. You still want that Boolean hanging off of the request itself.
Right.
I didn't quite follow that. You're suggesting a third type?
No. I'm saying that if you can already get the response through the call ID, then is invocation required even necessary? Because like the data is either there or it's not.
So
Well, that's the question.
The problem is you get the function call content,
Right.
and then it's sometime later you may or may not get a function result content.
Right. So you might have called it, but you might not have the result yet. So you might want to set it to true, even though you don't have the result already, is what I'm hearing.
and
Yes.
and it doesn't
But then
make
you
sense that the
can't inspect
invoker.
the result.
Yeah, so it doesn't make sense that
If
the
you're
invoker would replace
receiving
a
the
call with a
function call
response.
content, you need to know whether to invoke it or not. You then have to wait an arbitrary amount of time until you may or may not receive the corresponding function result that indicates that the function call content was not needing to be invoked. So basically, you'd have to buffer forever to
Or have like a
determine
task of function result content or something, which would
Right,
be weird.
Right.
So
This almost needs a task of function result content instead of a simple
Yeah.
Boolean, right?
No, I don't understand.
Because if you said that the scenario is to pass it through the middleware so that future middlesware can read the response, but the response might not be available, and the only way that the future middleware know that they're not supposed to invoke this is by looking at this property, that still doesn't mean that the response is immediately available to them. So presumably they need some way of polling for the response, right?
No, they don't. They often don't care about the response. This is
Oh.
really. I'm talking to you, and I say, here is a function call, but it's representing possibly two different things. One where I want you to invoke it, and one where I have already invoked it and I'm passing it purely as informational to you. So it's the Boolean is specifying which of those two things it is. Do I want you to invoke it? Or do I just want you to know about it? You don't need the result. I just need you to know what to do with it.
Well, presumably I would ignore it, right?
You would ignore it when?
I would ignore it if it's already been invoked because there's nothing I can do with it.
You
Like
might
the-
ignore it. You would ignore it for invocation purposes, for logging purposes, for display purposes, for propagation purposes. You would still do all that, depending on your role.
Yeah.
If you were just arbitrary middleware, you would
Right.
treat this like, and you weren't a logger, you weren't display, you weren't whatever. You would just pass it along like any other content.
So the part that confuses me is you're clearly expecting serial instead of parallel execution here because somebody's supposed to modify this object. So why don't they just remove the call and replace it with the response?
Because they represent two fundamentally different pieces of information.
Coming
And
at different
both-
times. It's a message pipeline. Yeah.
And both of those, like, I still can't, I want to display to the user that function ABC was called with arguments DEF and GHI. And then
Sure.
when the result comes in, I want to display, and the result of that was foobar.
So you mark it as true when you have
Invoke it.
enqueued handling the function?
Yeah. So middleware can both log and like call functions and stuff. It's very broad. So it needs to support all the things, this content is what it sounds
Right,
like.
but if the
Yeah.
result had all of the information of the request, which maybe it doesn't, but if it did, then somebody who, if the idea is that they're only ever supposed to be invoked once, then if you received a message function that could be called and you know how to handle it, then you would say, great, replace that with this function that was called, which is aka a response.
Because you can get a notification that it's being called long before it's completed. Or
Right,
you can
you
get,
still want- Oh, sorry.
Right,
Or,
so-
or you can get notification that it wants to be called. Like the function approval request content wraps the function call content.
Right, so
So
who
you're
sets
getting it-
invocation required to false?
No, the function call content, it needs to be invoked, but it's wrapped in something that says, but I need your approval to do it.
Okay. I'm just still not understanding who. If there's ever a time that somebody's setting this to false, it seems like that's the same as saying I have a response for it. And so I don't know why it's not substituted.
Well, the response could come later, right? Is
Yeah,
that what you
so
were saying earlier, Steve?
The function takes 3 seconds to run, or a minute to run.
Right.
So the function invoking chat client is going to stream back the function call content the moment it gets it, so that the client knows, display, I'm invoking long running function,
Okay.
and it shows up in your Copilot, right?
Mhm.
Meanwhile, the function invoking chat client is invoking the function, and then it produces a function result content when it's done, which also streams out, at which point the client says, then the result was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Fair. So yeah, so it's you change it from true to false when you have enqueued the function for background execution.
If you want to think of it that way, sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because you're
It
passing on to the
seems-
next person, you're changing it without an answer being ready, and you're telling future things, don't run this again.
It's not concurrent though. It's changing it before it streams it out.
Now,
So it's telling its caller, you do not need to invoke this. I'm taking care of it. But you don't have a result yet.
But if you
Okay,
have a
so
pipeline, the second thing, if it's handling it, you're saying it should be true, and things that are 3 and beyond in the pipeline always see it as false.
Yeah, everyone downstream will see it as false because they don't need to do anything with it.
Right, and
Right,
that's what I
so-
mean by you've streamed the fact that you've enqueued it for execution, but you may actually never come up with a response because you may have like timed out or died before you got there.
Well, sure, then they'd get an exception.
Fair enough.
So to be clear, let's take a scenario where we have just two middlewares, a function calling one and a logging one behind it. Let's say, if that makes sense. And then
Define what you mean behind it. Do you mean the function
behind
call
it,
that's
meaning it
wrapping
sees the modifications that the function calling middleware is making.
Okay, so it's
Which means it's the next after it runs after the function calling middleware.
from the perspective
logging
of
middleware
handling
does.
a response from a server.
So this is where I'm trying to get clear, like because it's like multi-directional, right?
So if the typical setup is not what you said. The typical setup is client calls through a pipeline that has function invoking followed by logging followed by talking on the wire. So
right, yeah. So that scenario.
So when I make a request, it flows through the function invoking, nothing happens. There's nothing to do yet. It flows through the logging. Logging says, hey, you're making a request. The server comes back and says, I want you to invoke function foobar. So the logging logs request for invoking foobar. The function
Before
invoking
the
chat.
function thing sees it.
What's that?
Before the function caller sees
Before
it,
the
the
function
logger would
invoking
see
sees it. Yeah. Because from the logging's perspective, it's just a request
Yeah.
response.
Mhm.
The function invoking says, I got a function call content that has invoke required true. I'm going to invoke it. If this is streaming, it's also still forwarding back that function call content to the client. So the client gets function call content with invoke required false. They can put up a message in their UI or whatever, log it to the, display it on the console. Function invoking chat client turns around and makes another request back to the server. So that goes through the log. The function invokes the function, gets the response, streams back to the client the function result, and makes another call back to the server going through the logging. So the logging sees another round trip that now includes a function result content. The server processes it, sends back a result. Assuming that doesn't have any function calls in it, it flows through the function invocation chat client and back to the client, and they get their final result, their final answer.
Okay, so in this scenario, the middleware is set up in a point where it always sees invocation required true, but it doesn't know how to invoke, so it will just like pass it along anyway to the function calling middleware when it receives a function call.
The middleware you're talking about is the logging?
Yeah, the logging.
Yeah, the
middleware.
logging it's not paying any attention to
Right.
invoke required. It's just tracing all the information.
Right, but if I
Yeah.
did put the logging middleware on the other side of the function calling middleware, which I could,
Right.
Then it would be logging. It would still log exactly the same thing, but if it logged invoke required, it would be logging false instead of true.
okay.
Exactly. Yeah, it depends on the position of the pipeline.
Mhm. So it makes it not that important where you put the logging, because like where you put it, you see every message. But there might be some modifications to like invoke required, which wouldn't be too relevant to the logging middleware.
So where you put the logging is much more impactful for non-streaming.
Okay.
Because for non-streaming, there's a single request made from the client through the pipeline. Like from the client's perspective, they make a single request and they get a single response. And so if logging were between the client and function invocation, it would log a single request and a single response. If
It would miss
logging
all
is
the function
between the function invocation and the server, it might see 100 round trips for that single request from the client, because the function invocation middleware is going back to the server every time the server requests a function invocation.
But streaming changes that, so everything passes through the full pipeline.
It's still the same number, it's exactly the same from the number of round trips perspective, but because of streaming, the middleware is sending out the function invocation middleware is surfacing all of the content it gets and produces as it gets it and produces it.
See, that's what was like confusing me before, because exactly like the function calling middleware doesn't necessarily need to forward like the request in, well, some cases, but with streaming for logging purposes and stuff, it's useful. It seems.
Right. In the non-streaming case, the content, all that content still eventually makes it back to the client. It as part of the chat response.messages. So there's still a single round trip from the client's perspective, but chat response.messages might include 99 messages because there were, 50 round trips or whatever it is between the function invocation chat client and the server. It's getting it all. It's just getting it in a different package at different times.
Later, and I mean, because it's not streaming, so yeah. I
Right.
guess
So
that makes
if you had
sense.
the
Yeah.
logger before between the client and the function invoking chat client, the logging is going to end up being batched rather than per message. And the logging is going to be representing, you're still going to see all the round trips, but you're going to see them in a single JSON payload in the log rather than spread out across multiple round trips.
That makes sense, I think. All right, thank you.
All right. If you have a pipeline that has multiple function invokers,
Mhm.
and the first one says, I can handle this and sets it to false, is it an error or just unexpected if the second one decides, I also will handle this, even though someone else said they did?
If you invoke a function call content that has invocation required equals false, you made a mistake. You are erroneous.
Okay, so that feels like it isn't invocation required versus optional. It's invoked or not.
Yeah, and in fact, like invocation required might imply wrongly to people writing logging middleware that they are supposed to do something they don't have to do. Like maybe that's an unwarranted concern, but yeah, saying that it's been invoked or saying almost inverting it and saying like already invoked or should not invoke might be better.
No, because that would have worked for the MCP scenario that I was describing. Basically, for the remote MCP, you now have this, let's say another piece of the pipeline where the invocation is happening in the server, right? But also you need to grab that invocation in an approval. In that approval, we have a function called content, which will have the invocation required set to false because because it has nothing to do with invocation locally in the function invoking chat client.
There's
that be
a
determined
question
contextually?
of what is the right name to use, and there's a question of the polarity. And
Yeah.
I think both of those are up for debate. We could certainly flip the polarity and have it be handled, I guess, or something. Or you don't need to do anything with this. We just need to come up with the right words.
Right, but it's
Right.
not
So if
it's
we
not
made
need
it
to,
handled-
it's must not.
Right. So if we made it handled, there would be like some scenarios where like it doesn't matter, right? Like if you're packaging it as part of an approval request, you're never expected. If it's packaged in an approval request, the receiver of that would never be expected to do the call, right?
So the way that works is typically the function approval will be wrapping the function call content. And so the approval kind of comes out of goes back to the client. And then the client sends back the approval result that says, actually, no, I want this to be invoked. And then when it's on its way back out, the function invoking middleware unwraps the original function call content and invokes it. So in that situation, handled or invoke required should be true, handled should be false. It would be strange, bordering on erroneous, to get a function approval result content or response content containing a function call content with already handled.
Right. It'd just be
make any
weird.
sense.
Yeah, exactly. Like, why are you giving it to me in that scenario if you don't want me to invoke it?
Right,
In
but
fact, we probably I don't even know if we checked for that case. We should throw an exception in that case.
But if function approval request content is not itself a function call content, it has one. It feels like an approval request should say that the invocation required is true because it's saying we haven't run this yet.
Right. So that the function approval request content will contain a function call content with invoke required equals true.
Right. I thought David just said it would be false.
For the MCP case.
Yeah, the client is not for the MCP case, the client is not required to do anything.
But the client receives the approval request and approves it.
Yes.
Yes, but they don't invoke the function.
Right. But what they received was an approval request, and then they approve it, and then the response really, I guess, feels like it needs to be unwrapped into a function call.
But the distinction is that there's a function call to be made, but who makes it? Is it being made on the server or is it being made on the client? If it's being made on the server, invoke required is going to be false because the client will not be invoking it. You might still need to approve it, but you better not try and invoke it.
Yeah. If you try to prove it, you will. The function invocation claim where we return that it didn't find it because it's not there. The tool that is asking for.
What's your concern, Jeremy? What's the confusion?
No part of it makes sense to me, like at all. An approval is an approval. Like you're approving, yes, go run this function. So I would expect the client receives approve, yes, go run this function, and then it sends back to the server, yes, go run this function.
Sends back to the server. It sends go run this function.
It responds to the approval request.
Yes.
Yes.
But you've got a pipeline on the client before it gets to the server. And depending on the data that you're approving, the invocation that you're approving might be happening on the client or the invocation might be happening on the server. And the middleware that's sitting in the client's pipeline needs to know what to do with it. Is the middleware in the client pipeline, when it receives approved, does it invoke the function or not?
So how in this case does the server know that it's supposed to see this invocation required false but change its mind and invoke it anyway when you said that was an error?
No, that would be an error for the client pipeline. So the Leaf iChat client that's sitting at the end of the pipeline that's putting things onto the wire, like it gets a request from the server that's a response from the server that says, dear client, I, the server, would like to invoke MCP tool foobar. Right? But I need your approval. So that gets translated into an MCP request wrapped in a function approval request content that flows back through the pipeline to the client who says, yes, of course I want to invoke foobar. So they put a function approval response content with that function call back into the pipeline. It flows back all the way through to that Leaf chat client, which sees I just got a function approval response content containing one for the MCP server. So I'm going to translate that to the way that OpenAI or Anthropic expects it to be on the wire, and it propagates to the server, which gets a response, which gets a new request saying, yes, please go ahead and invoke foobar.
So is the distinction that the one that invokes it knows it was its request ID?
It would
Because
be the function name.
You're
right?
saying when the
But like
client received the approval request, invoke said false. And then the client turns it into an approval response, invoke says false, because you don't want the client pipeline to get it. Then eventually something else gets it and now needs to say, I need to invoke this function, even though invocation required is false.
That Leaf iChat client is going to see that it's an what do we call it? MCP server tool request content. It knows what to do with an MCP server tool request content.
Sure, but if it happens to just be downstream of another piece of the pipeline that is trying to log that it saw an MCP server execution thing, it's going to be the right kind of thing, and or invocation required is going to be false, and now this other thing's going to invoke it, which is a mistake.
If invocation required is false, why would it invoke it?
Because that's what you told me happened.
Mm.
Okay.
No.
The server, something wants to invoke a function but needs consent.
Wants to invoke it on the client or server?
Something needs approval to do a thing.
On the client or server?
I don't know.
Well, that changes the answer.
Well, how do you determine whether it's client or the server that needs to invoke it? Is it the function name? Like if there's middleware that says, oh, I locally know how to run function foo and I see approval for it, I'll just run it. And if I don't know, I'll just keep forwarding along. And then eventually the last middleware says, well, let me try the server and see if it knows this. Is that kind of how you envision this?
So the way it works is it depends on who is providing the thing to be invoked. So if the thing to be invoked lives on the server, then the invocation happens on the server. If the thing to be invoked is supplied by the calling client, then the invocation is on the client.
Right.
So basically, but the on the client side, the things to be invoked are AI tools or AI functions. Like there's a type AI function. It's just a delegate with metadata. And so if the client provides one of those, then there's no way for the server to invoke it. The invocation happens on the client side. So the server sends back a message saying, you told me about function foobar, please invoke function foobar. The client is responsible for invoking it. Conversely, if the client sends a message that says, hey, there's this cool MCP server hanging out there at http learn.microsoft.com, dear server, I want you to use that MCP server as part of your processing. Then the server, in the case of OpenAI or Anthropic or others who do this, will say, oh, I know how to talk to MCP servers on the server. Look, there's this cool function called lookup.net method name in Learn documentation or whatever it's called. So it sends a response to the client saying, hey, I found this cool function that I want to use as part of your request, but I need your approval. I'd like your approval to run this function. The invocation is still going to happen on the server, but it's needing the client's approval to do it. Or if the client has already pre-approved everything, the server can just send a message saying, I invoked whatever I called that cool learn method. And it's going to show up on the client as, there's nothing you need to do with this. I'm just telling you that I invoked it.
Right. So your server wants to call a thing from MCP but needs permission.
Yeah.
So it generates a function approval request.
Yeah.
Which has a function call content.
Which is a derived MCP server tool call content.
Right. Is invocation required true or false?
False.
Okay. So it gets to the client.
Yeah.
The client has been trained by Windows to just click yes on everything. So they click yes.
Yep.
This issues an approval response that has a function call content.
A derived MCP server tool response content, yes.
Is invocation required true or false?
False.
Okay, so now this makes...
On the original function call content. There isn't one on the result content.
There's a function call content right here on the approval response.
There's no separate invocation required. That's just the original object.
Right. So the client doesn't change it.
Yep.
So invocation required is still false.
Yep.
Now it gets to the server.
Yep.
Now the server sees function approval response with a function call that says invocation required is false, which you told me means it's not allowed to invoke it, but it's going to anyway.
On the client. Invocation required is about what the client does with the content. It's the OpenAI responses chat client that's translating back and forth between the wire and MCP server tool content and MCP server tool response content doesn't care about invocation required because nothing on the client's invoking this. It ignores it.
So invocation required is only a client thing.
Yes. It's
Okay.
it's the recipient. It's like you're being given a function called content. What should you do with it?
I
a
assume this
consumer.
entire object is being transferred to the server.
No.
Okay, see that would be the big disconnect. I thought that this
Then
message
why-
got streamed to the server.
There's
But the
data in
entire
it that's
objects. Yeah. Go. Wait, the entire object is marked as serializable, so but it's not being transmitted
That's-
across a wire.
that's for logging purposes. So that or for persistence purposes, so that a client can store message history. But
Okay.
the JSON representation for this object model is meaningless to OpenAI or Anthropic or Gemini or AWS. They all have their own wire formats that are completely separate from how these things serialize.
So it's a
They have
thing.
no notion of invocation required.
So a thing on the client still has to send back to the server that something is approved.
Yes.
So
That's literally all the message contains. Call ID 12345 is approved.
okay. So this function call object, while the client pipeline is still handling it, is informative to the client, but when it hits talking to a server, it is turned into just request ID
We
and
could get
true.
rid of the highlighted line and nothing would break. I mean, it's informational only.
Okay. Because yeah, the big thing that was confusing me is I thought that this object was shared between the client and the server. At which
Yeah,
point invocation required made no sense.
These are purely a representation of an abstraction for representing requests and responses to and from the end of the pipeline that talks to the server, which happens over many different protocols for many different services.
Yeah. So whether somebody in voice said it or just somebody in chat, should we shove the word client in here?
Client invocation required or client handled, or is that what you mean?
Yeah. If it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense. But the notion that invocation required is false causes a function to be
I mean,
invoked.
this whole thing is associated with iChat client. Like this is all in the context of client. So
Okay. That's fair. In some protocols, which apparently this universe is not one of them, both sides consider themselves to be a client. So I assumed that everything on here, especially because they were marked with JSON, was wire protocol.
yeah, the JSON part is confusing. I get that. There are many different JSON representations. This JSON serialization is purely to be able to say, okay, I have my chat client history. I want to persist it into my data store and pick it back up tomorrow. So it's serialized and deserialized. But this JSON is different from the JSON that's used for OpenAI, which is different from the JSON that's used for Anthropic, which is different for the JSON that's used for Gemini, and it's different from the JSON that's used for AWS. They literally all have their own protocols. In fact, OpenAI has 3 different protocols. They all look different.
Fair enough. All right. So returning to a question from chat, is this allowed to toggle from false to true, or should it only go from true to false?
I can't think of any scenario where invocation required would go from false to true, but I may just don't have an imagination for it. Certainly none of the mainstream scenarios would have that.
Yeah, I wouldn't block it because it is just supposed to be informational. Yeah.
Fair enough.
But we can still have the conversation about, is the polarity right? Is the required too strong a name? It's all valid feedback. I don't have a better answer, but we come up with one, terrific.
Yeah.
Handled is probably the closest, I think. But
Is there,
What
I
it-
guess,
it
is there
handles so broad.
anything that happens if one of these hits the end of a pipeline, whatever that means, and it's still true?
as part of a
So something pushed into the stream, please go call local function foobar, and none of the middleware said, I know what that means. So you
so
hit the
that,
end
that
and,
happens
okay.
in the direction of the server sending a request to the client. So the server can say, I want you to invoke foobar. And depending on how the function invoking middleware can be configured to say, if you're asked to, if the server gives you a request to invoke something and you don't know what it is, how should you behave? How should you behave? The default is that the function invoking middleware says, I don't know what foobar is. And so it basically goes back to the server and says, you're hallucinating stuff. This is an error, try again. But you can configure it to instead say, I don't know what this is. I'm going to just pass it along to my caller and maybe they know what it is. In which case, such content could propagate all the way from the server out to the end client that made the initial request. And the client gets a function called content that still has invoke required true. And it's up to them to decide what they want to do with it. They could say, oh, actually, I do know what foobar is. I'm going to handle it. Or they could say the server is crazy. I'm going to go try a different provider. Or they could create a different, they could create a response that says, server, you're hallucinating. So based on whether invoke required is true or false, they can decide, was this already taken care of for me, or do I possibly need to do something?
Yeah, it feels like you're not saying required or permitted. But you're also, in the case of the server, issuing a declaration of serveriness. It's also not pending or invoked.
There's also often, there's another wrinkle, which is the way we ended up at required is when these AI services ask you to invoke something, if you don't, you basically can never talk to them again, at least not for the part of the same conversation. Because they'll say, I asked you to invoke foobar, you didn't invoke foobar, go away.
There's no way to just say, I decline to do so.
You basically create a result where the result is no. So,
But that was
Yeah.
you handling it by saying,
that was
no.
you handling it, yeah.
Okay, fair.
I
That's
say, anytime I've tried working with any of these tools, I ask it to do something, and it almost never does. So it's interesting that they aren't as lenient on the human side. Yeah. So if not for the server issuing the things, this feels like it's invoked or uninvoked. But then the server saying, I'm telling you about a thing, but you don't need to invoke it, definitely is a wrinkle. But, Levi had the comment, invocation required true, like, why isn't a logger supposed to invoke it? Well, because it's not an invoker. But, like, there's an object here. It says it's required. Yeah, I can't come up with a better name, because every name seems wrong in some dimension.
I mean, this might just be like, we don't have good examples of how to write these middlewares, and maybe just having that sample code would just kind of clarify all of this easily.
I mean, we have several of these middlewares, but there's only one that's responsible for invoking these, and that's the function invoking one. The other middleware components might log them, or to an iLogger, or there's one that traces it out to OpenTelemetry. But otherwise, most of the middleware will just propagate things without paying attention to the content. One that does throttling with what's our library for throttling? RateLayer.
Yeah.
It's just forwarding the content along. It's not paying attention to what the content is, because it's more about the all-up request.
What do you call it when the invoker is put in the mode of LeShrug? I don't know what this function is, but maybe somebody else does, so I'm just gonna pretend I didn't see this. What do you call that mode?
There's a property on the function invoking chat client. I forget the exact name, but it's something like terminate on unknown tool or something like that.
Okay. I will say chat has thrown forward a naming suggestion of observation only.
Or informational.
Yeah. Because from the MCP server, it is informational to the client. A handled thing is informational to anything else in the pipeline. So informational might be the right answer.
Some sort of, as part of flipping the polarity, basically not about whether this is something to be invoked, but whether this is purely information.
At that point, you would probably also exclude it from serialization, because it doesn't really make sense to persist.
I think
It does make sense to persist it, no? Because when it round trips, you still want to not invoke it.
Yeah, there's still the information that the presence of these things is still interesting. So when you persist this for in your data store so that you can pick up the conversation tomorrow and keep going with it, which is a very real scenario.
Oh yeah, of course.
The presence of this information in your chat history is useful information for the server.
Okay.
When you make your next request, you want to know whether there was a function call that was made or not.
Are these same abstractions also used for client callable functions, or are these abstractions just for things run on the server itself?
They're primarily for client ones, and we're adding it. Yeah, and we're adding in the chat. One of the things that we realized is, so they're primarily for the client, and already just on the client, we have this issue of when I get a function call content, I don't know whether it was already handled or not. And that's because there's this pipeline of things that logically, I'm talking to the next thing in the pipeline as if it is the server. And so from my caller's perspective, what I get back, even if it was invoked on the quote client, from my perspective, it was downstream of me as the server. And now we're adding in the fact that there might actually be a process or machine or network hop to the invocation of something actually being really the server.
Got it. So would I use these? So I would use the function approval request content type, for instance, to say, yes, I approve this client tool being called.
Yes. So so I can, when I put a tool into my pipeline, into my request, I can say this tool that I'm giving you requires approval.
Okay.
Now servers, today's AI services know nothing about that. All they know is they're getting a list of tools that they can invoke.
Right.
But the client's pipeline is aware of it. And so the client pipeline says, oh, I see, the function invoking chat client says, okay, I got this tool that requires approval. When I send it down the pipeline, I'm sending it down as a normal tool effectively. But when the request to invoke it comes back to me, rather than just invoking it, I'm going to in turn send a function approval request content up the stack to my caller. And then when the caller sends back the approval response and the function invoking chat client gets it, because, okay, I received a tool. I asked the server, I gave it to the server asked me to invoke it. I asked for permission. Now I have permission. So now I can invoke it and send the result back in the next request to the server.
All right, so I've had my hand up for a while, and I'm trying to figure this out. And listen, but the MCP server call content, I'm looking at David's like ASCII flowchart. Like, so I get that there might be some scenarios in some cases where you have multiple function invoking middlewares on the client that might be responsible for different function calls based on their own criteria. And if they can't handle it, they want to. But this isn't that. This is approvals for like an OpenAI server to call like an MCP server. And I just don't understand why we need the initial MCP server tool call content on the pipeline at all for an approval. Because like in the ASCII diagram, it gets immediately converted somewhere into the function approval request content. But why doesn't it start that way before it
So I
enters
think
the middleware pipeline?
David's diagram, if I'm looking at the same one, might be confusing things. His diagram includes hosted MCP server tool. Is that the one that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think so.
That's a completely different scenario.
Okay. So
So
this isn't where OpenAI is hosting the MCP server. This is where the client has a local MCP server.
right. So now we're getting into a more complicated use case, and one that we haven't even decided whether we're shipping yet. But so the basic idea is okay, I'll take a step back. So the servers, OpenAI and Anthropic, are the main two today that can do it. As in your tool list, you can send an HTTP MCP server URL.
Yep.
And you can basically just say, as part of my request, I would like you to be able to use that server. And the AI service, OpenAI or Anthropic, will do the back and forth between that MCP server on the server side. So if you give pre-approvals to everything, because that's a simpler scenario to talk about, it'll do that back and forth without ever coming back to the client. Okay? It'll tell you about
in
it.
that scenario, if you don't have pre-approval, will you in the middleware pipeline get the function approval request content immediately prior to like receiving any function call content?
If I send a request that says, here's my chat options, it contains an MCP server tool for learn.microsoft.com, and thou shalt require approval for everything. That goes to the server, to OpenAI. OpenAI decides as part of the request that they want to use learn.microsoft.com.getContent or whatever that tool is called. So they end the request then and there, sending back a response that says, I would like to invoke MCP tool learn.microsoft.com getContent. Our iChat client that's sitting at the edge of the wire gets, deciphers that OpenAI response and turns it into a function approval request content wrapping an MCP server tool request content, which flows all the way back to the original requester who says, oh yeah, I like learn.microsoft.com, approved.
In that scenario specifically, invocation required is kind of irrelevant because it's just like an approval request. Like, of course, you're not requiring invocation.
Well, yes and no. If it's exactly as I described, yeah, it's kind of irrelevant. But you could imagine having, if you wanted to, you could imagine having that same server, that same MCP server register on the client. You don't want it to be used.
Interesting.
So it's still going to pay attention to it, but it's kind of irrelevant.
It would be weird for it to ask approval in that scenario rather than just call the thing. If it's asking for the client to call it, the client could still ask for approval in the UI. But
if it was, as I'm getting confused by the its and those so let's just finish that example, then we'll go on to the other one. So at that point, the response flows all the way back to the Leaf iChat client, which says, I have approval, and it translates that into the OpenAI responses message that is, yes, dear OpenAI, you are able to invoke learn.microsoft.com getContent. Right? And then that goes off to the server. The scenario that David has in his flowchart is for a case where the server that you're talking to doesn't know anything about MCP. So if you're talking to Gemini, for example, It has no concept of server-side MCP tool invocation, at least not today. I wouldn't be surprised if they had it tomorrow. So if I'm the client and I create my chat options and I'm putting the MCP server tool into my chat options, it's going to be ignored when talking to Gemini because it knows nothing about it. So one of the things that we've been experimenting with is an iChat client middleware that does know about that MCP tool, and it can replicate the server-side behavior as part of the client pipeline. So it can basically use the MCP C# SDK to talk to the server that you put with your MCP server tool and replace the MCP server tool in your chat options with the AI functions for every tool that server exposes, or the ones that you said it was okay to use. At which point then those raw tools are going to be what's flowing through the pipeline. And if when the server gets those tools, it's just going to see a normal client-side tool like any other. It'll request a normal client-side tool like any other, and that'll flow back. If that MCP server chat client were to if that MCP server chat client were to have approval, or approval acquired, then it's going to be using this client-side approval required thing.
So I think that hang up with invocation required or whatever we name it in particular is this like kind of competing, conflicting interests that are like, we want to give middleware as raw of a representation of like what's on the wire as kind of possible. Like if, OpenAI is making a function call, we want to like show them the function call, but at the same time, we're trying to duplicate this like approval flow. Because in my mind, if I'm middleware trying to do this, rather than using an invocation required bool, if I am trying to turn MCP call so it looks like a approval to other middleware, like I would do that, right? Like I would take the function call, I'd make sure I put the middleware close enough to the wire that I get it prior to the thing that does approvals, like prior to the end client doing the approval, right? And then I would just put in, I would take out the function call content and replace it with, or wrap it rather, with a function approval request content, pass it down the pipeline. And then there's no ambiguity, like there's no risk that like, oh, the middleware like behind me that sees the messages I've replaced misinterprets things. Like, sure, the logging might not be accurate per se if you put it in the wrong place, but like, I think removing the ambiguity altogether, which is function calls are one thing and approvals are another, and we can still turn function calls into approvals in middleware, like potentially.
I guess I'm
it
unclear
doesn't
how's
have to
that
be a
different
bool.
from what the approval content is separate from the function call content. It's just rather than have to duplicate all the function call information onto the approval, and rather than having to have a separate set of types for MCP on the server versus functions on the client versus shell invocations on the client versus whatever, that we're able to just have a single approval type, one for request, one for response, that can be used with any call.
Don't get me wrong. Like I'm saying that I like function approval request content.function call. I'm just saying that function call context or content dot invocation required doesn't seem necessary when like you could say if I see the function call content as like top level content and I'm function invoking middleware, I should call it. And if I see an approval request, I should do an approval flow. But having the bool on the content seems like it creates like a denormalization kind of thing, right?
I
like
guess
it could be wrong.
So I'm struggling with that because forget approval for a moment. We already have the issue that you get a function call content and it's ambiguous whether you should invoke it or not.
So that is another problem, but I think that's like way more niche, right? Like you have multiple middlewares that are responsible for setting like overlapping versions of functions, and
it's
then
not
you
though.
want
It's not niche because you don't know. You really do want to know whether the call is informational or not. Like with AGUI, you're getting notifications from the server about functions that the server invoked, or you're getting notifications from the server about things that the client should invoke. You're
And I'm saying you should always know that from context, except for in niche scenarios where this isn't high enough fidelity,
what's the
right? Like it's a
context?
single bool. Well, it's
don't-
either I'm not a function invoking middleware, so I never invoke functions,
I'm-
or
I'm-
I am, and then I know
I'm-
which functions I'm responsible for.
I'm the client. I'm the end client. I'm the one who's issuing the requests. I get a function call content. What am I responsible? Do I need to send a function response to it?
Do you need, sorry, say it again. Do you need to send a function response when?
I get my ultimate response and it contains a function call content. Do I need to send a function result content in my next turn?
If you haven't like configured,
How do I know?
that I think is an application thing. Like I'm saying, if you don't know, I'm not sure a bool is enough. Like, right? Like that's something you should know as an application developer.
If there's a request for a function, I don't know. Even if there's a function invoking Checkline in my pipeline, I don't know whether it invoked it or not.
Yeah. So
but
I think that the term that you've come back to a couple times now, Steve, is informational. And so I think a lot of the status of if we just call it informational, and if informational is true, this means it's a thing that you get to inspect, and if informational is false, it's a thing that should be acted on.
it's just a foot gun because things are going to see function call contents and call it and not look that, oh, it's only informational. Like we don't have like endpoint invoked on HTTP context or whatever. Like there's, single thing that's responsible for it. And if it's not, it's whoever like decides to terminate. Yeah, I don't know. But the other thing is like, you can't just put law. Yeah, it's weird because you don't have this need to pass through all the informational streaming things to the end client. So it is a different scenario. But I am worried about the foot gun, that people just aren't going to check it, not know it exists.
I think that is a valid concern. I don't have a better answer for it.
Yeah, it sounds to me a little bit like the original expectation was a function call content is handled, and then you bolted on the option of don't terminate the session just because you can't handle it. And that's when things got weird.
Well, not exactly. They got weird first, which is why we bolted on that option.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I right now, given the need to like stream everything, including the function calls to the end client, and given that you can support just a subset of function calls and we don't have a better alternative, I guess it's fine. It does seem like a big foot gun, though. Like, I do think people are going to ignore this when they shouldn't.
Yep, I mean, just
I think
means
that-
it'll get double invoked.
I mean, to be clear, that's already the case. We're just not telling you it's the case.
Yeah, so now there's the option that it won't get double invoked.
Right.
The
I see.
alternative would be the thing that I had suggested of the invoker deletes the call content and replaces it with a result content. You need more information on the result, like what was the call content. But if it's too late to do that, then it's too late to
We
do
would
that.
need to duplicate all of the function call content onto the result. And even then, it's normally too late. So we will have, in streaming, we will have already given you back the function call content. before we have the result one. There's no opportunity then to unify. There's no opportunity to remove
Fair
it
enough.
in the stringing case.
So I guess it would then be replace function call content with FYI function call content.
Right.
And now
that
you're
wraps the function call content.
then
which
you're saying
honestly
you
is
want that
less
to be the
risky.
Boolean informational.
Yeah. But you could have like a informational like or function call information type, which is like derived from AI content and not function call content, and contains the function call content. Like that's not that far off of what we're doing with like the input request content itself, right?
We would be, so it is already the case and has been since October of 2024
Yeah.
that function call contents are sent back to the client,
But is
even
it
if
but
they've been
like
invoked.
okay. It's like it's like just how often are people using that? Like the informational only function call content. Will they be broken too much? Like if they're just JSON serializing it for logging and stuff.
Yeah.
Well,
I think a cleaner
absolutely
design
broke.
would be have a thing to be invoked and then a FYI a thing was invoked that are different. So one gets eaten and replaced with the other, but if that ship sailed a long time ago,
Yeah, and that sailed a long time
then
ago.
informational, and we can bolt another word on there if anybody wants of informational only or whatever, but informational seems fine, and like we can move on because I think we've spent an hour on this one property name.
Hour 30.
There was a lead up.
Yeah.
There was the whole part where I didn't read request and response correctly. Come on, Steve, give me some credit. I've made more mistakes than this one.
I'll give you a lot of credit. Sorry, Jeremy.
Yeah. All right. All right. Any strong objections to renaming invocation required to informational? Note that does invert its polarity.
Doesn't the invocational name make it easier to miss versus invocation require? Or not really, because the only ones that would honor this, well, the major case that is going to honor this is the function invoking child client, which is owned by us, so we should be doing it right.
I actually prefer like invocation forbidden if we want to like make it noisy or encourage people to look at it.
Yeah, but that's when it gets weird if it's used to represent the not yet invoked MCP server function. It's the client should not invoke it, but the function still should be invoked. Since it's informational to the client, but it's actionable to the server. So informational is the state that the person looking at this property sees. So I like it because it's neutral on the position of is it invoked or will be invoked or was invoked. It's if you're looking at this, it's FYI.
Should we say it's informational only?
Steve, David?
I have no preference.
I think only is stronger if we're worried about people misusing it.
Okay.
Levi, your hand's still up. Do you have a question?
Oh yeah, I can't see hands by the way, so just.
Oh yeah. It was actually about a different property when we're done discussing this one.
Oh, good.
All right. Going once, going twice. Informational only. Okay.
Yay.
Moving on. Levi, you have a question apparently.
Yeah, my internet just cut out, sorry. But I can still talk to you, so hey. I had a question about call ID and I think request ID, two different properties on related types. How are those properties related?
They are not related. Request ID is meant to be the one for an approval request, and the call ID is for the actual call. Once the call is being approved, is approved.
So the MCP server knows nothing about request ID. It doesn't send it. It doesn't receive it.
No, no, no. The MCP does send the request ID because the approval request originated in the MCP. Oh, sorry. No, no. Yeah, you're right. You're right. The MCP server does know nothing about the request ID. It's the service consuming the MCP server that generates the request ID.
So the request ID is generated. It's generated within our client code then.
Yeah, it's also generated it's generated in two places, in the function invoker client and in the service. So for example, OpenAI will give you a request ID.
David, in the service case, are you getting to a call ID at the same time that you're getting a request ID?
Yes.
You're getting both, even though the call hasn't happened yet.
I believe so, yeah. But I cannot recall quite. Let me check and I'll give you the answer in a bit.
Okay, it's just because it'd be, if you didn't, so it would mean you wouldn't have one to create the
Yep.
call content for the
Yeah,
MCP case. I guess the maybe this is where Levi was going, but why? If the server is actually giving us two different IDs for the same thing, then that's one thing. But if they're not, raises a question about why we need a separate ID.
Well, if the way that I understood your response, Debbie, please correct me if I misunderstood, is that if the server is asking you to invoke a client-provided tool, the server isn't really going to provide a request ID for that because they just expect you to invoke it, right? Like they don't need an approval.
Yep. Yeah.
Well, in that case, the call ID is what you get, because they're asking you to they're trying to call a function.
Right.
Actually, I'll take that back. Sorry, what I was mentioning about the service request, it doesn't come with the separate request ID for the MCP tool call.
So you're just getting a call ID, right?
You are getting a request ID because it's called MCPR underscore and then a bunch of random numbers. But that's what we will use for the MCP tool call.
So is it the same value in the approval request content request ID and the function call content call ID?
I hope so.
Well, so the reason I brought this up is if my question is, what happens if you see two different things with the exact same request ID and you approve one of them? What happens to the other?
I'll hope. So you're saying that you have two request IDs, duplicated like two function approval request contents with duplicated request ID. Is that what you're saying?
So I see one function approval request come across that says I want read-only access to your calendar, request ID 12345, and I see a second one that comes across that says I want write access to your bank account, request ID 12345.
In that case, I will hope that well, nothing happens really because we don't really validate. I mean, if they are originating on the service, we don't validate that they are unique or something like that.
The thing I'm struggling with, David, is, and maybe this would make Levi's question go away, is why do we need request ID at all? Why isn't that just the underlying call ID?
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I think we could oh, it's because you need to match them in the but you need to match it in the function invoker client, right? And those are synthetic. But still you could get away maybe with the call ID. So it might be something that we could explore more.
Well, this is kind of where I was going with this, because you have a concept of being able to create a request approval response object directly from the request approval type, but you've also said multiple times throughout the course of this meeting that you're using the call ID basically as a key inside of a dictionary somewhere, just kind of ambiently available in the environment to look up information about a particular call. And the thing that I was getting at is, like, if it's just a key in an ambient dictionary, could someone stomp on that key by providing you two simultaneous request IDs, one innocuous, one malicious?
So,
And what do you expect middleware to do in that case?
so a couple things. One, I mean, you could certainly, the call IDs are expected to be unique. If you were to get two that were the same, you're already in dangerous ground, because you'd be sending back a result to the server and maybe answering the wrong question. I think the reason we ended up with request ID is because we had separate, like the user input base type, which is now input base type, had multiple derivations from it, each of which was able to source an ID from a different place. So you had function calls over here, you had MCP things over here, and so we needed an ID to be able to correlate request and response that was separate from what was being wrapped.
Mhm.
At this point, we don't have multiple separate things. Request ID is always going to be function call content.call ID. Always. Now it's possible in the future we will have other things deriving from input request content and input response content, which may not be function calls, and therefore may have an ID that comes from a separate place. But that makes me think that request ID shouldn't be a constructor parameter on the base type. Request ID should be like a virtual input response content, input request content should be abstract types. Request ID should be an abstract member, and it should just forward the function call contents call ID, because that's what it always is in this case. And then if we ever had other derivations of input result request content, input result content, they would have and they had their own ID, they would be providing that via their own override.
Yeah. And I think that would go some way toward helping this. Ultimately, what I guess, David, since you're kind of the proprietor of the system, what I wanted you to think about is, like, if there are request IDs or call IDs or whatever coming from potentially multiple different authorities, and all of them are being merged together into a single kind of ambient state dictionary, how do you keep them separate? And how do you know that some IDs could have originated from a trusted authority, such as within the current client, and some could have originated from a potentially hostile authority, such as a remote service that you're talking with? And what do you do to disambiguate those should you see a conflict? And importantly, how does middleware handle this? Because we're talking about the design and implementation of middleware components, correct? So, like, presumably our sample code would include information about how to avoid this situation in the first place.
Well, the middleware would just these MCP requests will just bypass middleware because it's not related to function invocation per se.
Isn't one of the middleware potentially giving a response back for I approve this function be called or not?
No, it will be the user.
Well, the user is ultimately providing the consent through a UI flow, but is a middleware the thing popping that UI flow?
I guess you could have a middleware for that.
Yeah.
So I guess is that the
yeah.
question? Well, is that the one you're referring to?
Or if you have a middleware that's marked as always approve reading my calendar, and the request ID that happens to correspond with an invocation of read my calendar conflicts with a request ID that corresponds to, drain my bank account. An approval is going to be automatically done there. Is the approval automatically done for the right thing?
I mean, the context is going to see the approval flow, so the security the protocol security problem that you're pointing out of a duplicate request ID, like it will have already happened. The server will have whatever authenticated approval that it needs to go attach to the context.
Oh
so
yeah, yeah.
you've already lost.
I'm only talking about client here.
Yeah, the
Absolutely.
client.
Like, if the server's malicious, you've lost. Yeah.
The client, like saying that you think that the client should track approval IDs and it should get really, really angry if it sees one twice. Like, I think that's fine, but I don't think it changes the API. As for the comment of
I don't
request
think
ID
Yeah.
being virtual, I don't think the cost of the extra reference is all that bad compared with introducing virtual. Like, I would get rid of this constructor parameter, but I would just make it call base with function call.callID.
I guess if I could succinctly summarize my concern, then it was, does the current API design rely too much on middleware going to sidecar state dictionaries for information? And if that's the case, does the current API provide too much opportunity for malfeasance? That's really where I was going with that.
If the servers are only identifying the request by string, I don't know that there's a lot of value in saying that the approval request attaches that the approval response attaches the entire approval request, which would be the only way you could really disambiguate which request is it.
Right.
So,
have we given the middleware enough information to be successful here?
but the only thing that's going to react to the approval response is the thing that generated the request. So somebody knows I'm now waiting on a response for request 1234.
Well, it was more like somebody says, I approve invocation of the tool associated with request 1234, and then someone else in the pipeline says, oh God, which thing was actually request 1234, because now I'm confused. That was my concern.
Yeah,
Like,
but
if you have a sidecar dictionary, like, if we have a sidecar dictionary instead of types that kind of nicely encapsulate all of these, does the sidecar dictionary itself allow, say, overwriting what 1234 was? Whereas having a strongly typed hierarchy of APIs would have prevented that in the first place. Because I heard a lot of discussion about you need to keep all of this stuff kind of categorized yourselves in these sidecars. And I'm like, that's opportunity for failure right there whenever we tell people this is your concern, not ours.
Okay, so sorry, I'm not following quite through. How are we supposed to avoid that scenario where it gets replaced, like the request ID gets?
You tell me. You're the one who designed this, right?
Okay,
like,
yeah, I guess I'm
yeah.
asking for advice. If there is any kind of prescribed way to proceed here.
It would be helpful to see sample code, I think, because that would kind of give an idea of how you envision middleware authors to write these components, and that would also kind of help clarify whether people could fall into these pits of failure.
Can we follow up this offline, Levi? Can I follow that up with?
Well,
it could affect the API service. That's why I brought it up during API review.
For what it's worth, I don't think it will.
Okay.
I think it's worthwhile to clean up the request ID stuff. Maybe with, I don't know if it was Jeremy or Levi who said remove string request ID from functional requests constructor. We could talk about, whether we have them on the base constructor or those are virtuals or whatever. But fundamentally, I think this is just propagating the same thing that all the services do, which is expose a string ID and require correlation of separately provided request and response information. And that's just propagating through the chain.
Yeah.
On top of which, there are relatively few middleware components that actually need to look at this stuff. Certainly more could, but in terms of the ones that need to, we basically provide them. And so maybe we would get it wrong, but we'll try really hard not to.
Yeah.
I trust us to get it
So
right.
the concern that Levi has elevated into me, so I'll say it and see if it. I'll go through the whole and what I would do to react to it, and we can see how we feel. Is if in your pipeline you're talking to two different servers, so they don't know about each other's request IDs, and they happen to generate the same one. So each of those pieces of reaction-y middleware issues an approval request 1, 2, 3, 4. The client approves 1, 2, 3, 4, and each of the middlewares think it's them who's supposed to tell their server, go ahead with the thing you were doing. The fix, if all this is supposed to stay in memory, is if the approval response contains the approval request object, then the middlewares don't track the strings they're looking for, they track the objects they're looking for.
Yes.
And now you get a reference equals, and now I tell my server 1, 2, 3, 4 is approved, as opposed to I'm just looking for the string 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yes, exactly.
So that would mean that the approval response gets maybe it's optional because sometimes you don't have it because it's just for logging, but gets this is the request object that I am approving instead of just this is the request ID I am approving.
So
I don't understand how that fixes the problem.
It's reference
Especially if the whole
equality
thing
of an
is-
object you generated versus a string that happens to be
Yeah,
the same.
If the whole thing was serialized and deserialized, you lose reference equality.
Yep.
When it gets deserialized, presumably you would make you would rehydrate the object that it was associated with.
It depends on if reference duplication is, or if you're serializing with reference graphs or with object values.
That would still be okay, I would think, but I understand.
Well, you'd lose it if it's values because you'd dupe it and then it wouldn't be in your dictionary. It wouldn't reference equals in your dictionary or your pending queue or whatever.
But you could still look up useful properties off of it. Though.
Yeah.
And
So
you
I
would
guess
know that they would have the right values.
so. Really, should each middleware then be able to attach the namespace or context of which middleware it is, so that the approval request, and maybe this is why call ID should be different than request ID, that the middleware is supposed to give their own namespace in the request ID so they don't confuse it with another middleware.
You're saying you would expect that the request ID passed to functional approval request content is a manufactured GUID?
I mean,
Or
not necessarily a GUID, but like the concatenation of the middleware type name with like the call ID or something.
yeah,
Middleware type.
You
name.
you namespace it effectively, so
Yeah.
two different middleware can never conflict with one another.
and again, it could be a second property. So you have the what's the server or what's the final request ID, but what's the scope ID?
Yeah,
and
I
the
don't
scope
think-
ID would be
I don't think middleware name solves it, because you can have the same middleware used with two different servers. If the concern was two different servers giving you the same IDs.
Right. Yeah. Type name wouldn't work because you could have like.
Yeah, but so that's
some-
why
some-
I
some
said
scope, though.
context.
Yeah, discriminator. Yeah.
So
hence GUID. If you're looking for absolute uniqueness and you're concerned about conflicts,
sure. A GUID generated in the middleware to get to the client to then come back, and then it turns that GUID back into the server request ID.
I mean, now you need to keep a sidecar of what GUID's associated with which middleware. But yeah.
No, well, that depends on if you're GUIDing the middleware, if you're GUIDing the approval.
Sure.
If you're GUIDing the approval, then you just, again, have a dictionary of GUIDs you're looking for. And then you know it's to you, and now you send it to your server and bump it out of your dictionary.
this is. Are we concerned about what? Are we concerned about some sort of accidental misuse, or are we concerned about malicious use, or both?
Malice.
I'm being
For
more
me, it's malice.
concerned about if the server is the one issuing the request ID, then the entire sensibility of this depends on request IDs being random and long. But if anyone can set up a random server that then gets talked to, and they happen to feel that, I don't know, what did we use for value task? A short is a good enough request ID, then now there's going to be a lot of duplication across random shorts being generated from parallel servers. So again, they have
So-
no notion of
At least the services that are out there today, OpenAI, Anthropic, Gemini, AWS, they use IDs with very high entropy. Like they're 15 to 25 characters long, the
Mhm.
full alphabet plus either 36 base 36 or base 64 or whatever.
Mhm.
It would be very surprising to get duplicates across those services.
But
you're
if we're
talking
trying to
about,
abstract over local MCP calls, yeah, if that's where you're going.
well, I was gonna say,
Right.
if you're talking about malice, if you're able to inject something into the pipeline, you're screwed.
No, that's the thing.
Not
Like the
necessarily.
talking with an MCP server is by definition on the other side of a trust boundary. Our callers cannot be
No.
screwed.
Injecting middleware.
Oh yeah, middleware's code. That's fine.
No, I think the scenario is like if you're abstract, like say you're not talking to OpenAI and you're trying to, or let's say that you have multiple middleware that are talking to OpenAI but doing local MCP function calls, right? And they just use the request ID the MCP servers give them.
Mhm.
Like one MCP
Sorry,
server.
what do you mean the request ID the MCP server gives them?
Yeah, I'm not saying this is how it would be implemented.
No, I don't
but if
understand. That call IDs don't come from MCP servers.
I
thought approvals had request IDs, which were the same as call IDs.
these are
So MCP has no notion of approvals.
that's true.
Any approval from an MCP perspective would be handled by the host invoking the MCP tool.
Mhm.
In the case of server-side hosting, that's OpenAI generating a call ID. If we were to do client-side hosting, that would be our own middleware component, and it would be required to come up with a unique ID to represent the approval.
So
I see. You're right.
I guess the question is any chat session going to be engaged in two different request ID generators?
Yes, that's absolutely.
Right.
You
And-
might be talking over the course of your history to OpenAI, Anthropic, AWS, Gemini, etc.
Yeah, and so my concern would be that Microsoft Core Engineering and Microsoft HR both set up chat clienty things, and whoever set up their server thought it was good enough to use a 16-bit identifier for request IDs. And I'm more concerned about the accident of you're talking to two contexts that just use too low of a string length for request ID. If we build
Or
it into the
combo.
protocol here of how an approval gets routed back to the right middleware to handle the approval, then we've solved it in our code flow problem. If we're depending on the remote parties of never generating the same request ID to the same session, which they don't know about session being across multiple servers, that's scary.
Already a problem. That already exists separate from middleware components. If I just make a request to OpenAI and then I make a request to Anthropic, I already run into the possibility that my chat history has function call requests from one or the other.
Right, but if
Yes.
the
And how do we solve that?
if the function
don't.
approval
It's
request
impossible.
said this is to
Why is it
OpenAI,
possible?
then
Because we
only
have
the
to send-
OpenAI
we have to
middleware would send it
what
back.
the server provided.
But like I mean, sure, but we could add to it and subtract to it, right? Like
Not when we send to the server. It has
not
to
when
be
we
what
send to the
server
server, but we could add a bit to be like, okay, locally, this is the Anthropic prefix plus the Anthropic request, ID, and this is the OpenAI prefix plus the OpenAI request ID. This is our second OpenID subscription, or sorry, not OpenID, OpenAPI subscription with its own
wouldn't-
prefix.
Wouldn't that set a precedent? I mean, this is not a problem confined only for this specific request ID stuff.
It's a problem if any consumer of these services can be talking about approvals where request IDs are in independent namespaces.
Right.
So this is in our version of the object, if we tack a namespace on it, whether that's what's the name of the server, what's the type name of the client handling it, etc., then we now get the middleware to say, yes, this is a request ID I was waiting for. I'm going and this response is to me instead of it's a response with the same ID to another server in this pipeline. So this is about the local state of you're the only one who knows you're talking to two different things that generate request IDs.
But then if you, for all the logging purposes, for all the steps involved in the pipeline and everything else, you will be storing things that are
Sure.
Extra data.
Yeah,
potentially.
extra data.
It'll say
Yeah.
function
And-
approval request
yeah.
to openai.com request ID OAI underscore 36 character string. Yep.
And we
Which
want
gets back to my original question of, is the API shape as proposed here sufficient to allow anybody looking at the abstraction to differentiate the scope of two different
it
approvals?
is. I think it is sufficient.
Yeah, I don't think anything,
Okay.
nothing we've talked about would change anything that's on the screen. What I hear people
Okay.
talking about is what is the value of that ID? And do
Well,
we
like
want, do we, and because what you're saying is you would need the function invoking chat client when you construct it to accept a GUID, such that every time you construct it across server server restarts, you always provide it with the same GUID, such that it's able to then add that GUID into request content, look for that GUID in the response content, and correlate with the one that it has, and stripping it out as part of anything that it forwards along.
And mind you, it doesn't have to be a GUID, right? Like it could
Oh, yeah.
be OAI1, OAI2, like it can be a string literal, like a type name isn't good enough.
Well, no, it has to
Right,
be a unique identifier.
It has to be unique to your application. But it's like kind of like take our data protection APIs, right? Like in theory, we could have like not included the purpose there and been like, well, it's on you to concatenate the purpose properly and do all the things correctly, right? But we don't do that because we don't
Because it's
expect people
hard.
to do that. Yeah, exactly.
But-
so that's
again-
why we changed the API.
But none of that impacts what's on the screen.
It kind of does, because it means that like you should have like request ID and request scope if we think that's like a real
Yeah.
scenario.
What? Why? Why isn't it just part of request ID?
Because the request
Same
ID is
reason
generated by the
purpose is not
server.
part of the data in data
No,
protection.
nothing says that the request ID is generated by the server.
Okay, so the middleware that received a function authorization request, or sorry,
It could put
approval
whatever
request.
it wants in request ID.
So you think it should namespace itself?
No, I don't think it should. I think this whole discussion is really over engineering, but it could.
Okay, so you think the OpenAI one knows OpenAI generates really long request IDs, and something that's talking to Microsoft Core Engineering chat server and says your request IDs are too short, I'm going to slap a context in front of them and I'm going to parse it back off before I tell you it's approved.
OpenAI, Foundry, Anthropic, they're using the IDs that they generate as indexes across the entirety of their user base into databases to look for content. That if you have a duplication across there, they're already in trouble.
Yes, correct.
Right, but
I'm
And-
talking about a malicious server, not a server that is accidentally creating duplicates.
and I'm more concerned about accidental because I'm having trouble figuring out where a malicious one gets in the pipeline. But
So someone takes over the server.
Right, like imagine you have like OpenAI, Anthropic, and some like small company that is hosting your models or whatever, and they get hacked, and then someone would have to figure out what the request IDs are for another provider that they want to serve. So I mean, it's not easy.
So,
but
question: if someone already takes over the server, why wouldn't they just call flush bank account?
that's why I'm
Because
not worried
well,
about
because
it.
it's a
That's a
different
client
server.
tool, not a server tool.
Right. It's a different server, right? Like imagine that, it's about compartmentalization, right? You don't want to give a one server, like, sure, that one's hacked and they have the ability to do whatever they want with their, tools and LLM or whatever context they have, but you shouldn't allow them to like spoof an approval request for like another provider.
Okay,
Right.
if we're concerned about client tools, as we said,
Or server to
could-
server.
Yeah.
Anything that can go beyond the scope that it's normally approved for. Yeah.
So, I guess then, would you be willing to accept the notion that function approval request content
Hold on.
throws if the request ID is less than 20 characters?
I don't think that solves the problem.
It's also, this is just middleman. This is just what's being provided. And to saying that we're placing restrictions or we're forcing anything that's creating these approval request contents to have at least 20 characters, that just strikes me as unnecessary
Okay.
overhead, governance, compliance. I don't know. I don't get it.
We're saying the entire client security model on this is depending on if they're talking to two different servers that the request IDs are never the same. And me saying, fine, so if the request ID has to be long, now you're saying they have to both have bad entropy, which is fine. But if a server is willing to generate a request ID that's only 3 characters, it's going to stomp on the ID of some other server that only generates a 3-character ID. And that's my concern.
And when that server does that, you're sending back results for a different thing.
No, you get a would you like to do blank, and you say yes, and then both pieces of middleware think, wait, I have an outstanding request, 1, 2, 3, authorize it. But you were only authorizing one of them. That's the security bug in this entire protocol. This whole thing is set up for that security bug.
Yes.
And that's why I would feel better if there was a minimum length on the request ID. I don't have a good
guess
number.
what you're trying to say, Steve, is like you're saying like in practice, like while you can have multiple middlewares and all of that, like whoever is generating the request ID is always going to be a single entity, almost always. Is that true?
As part of an individual request that I make, I'm talking to one backend. I might switch what that backend is over time.
Right, so that was the question I asked earlier of would there be 2 different request ID generation sources in the same pipeline? Would you be talking to both Anthropic and OpenAI in the same pipeline?
At the same time, that would be an incredibly strange setup.
Okay, so
Yeah.
so
Over
approvals,
time,
server
sure.
approvals are always to one. There's probably only one server in your whole pipeline.
That's actually generating these approval request IDs.
That is
probably
that
true.
is different than the model that I thought I understood based on earlier responses.
It might change over time. I might make one request, have some interactions with OpenAI, and then switch to have interactions with Anthropic. That is very common.
Right, but
I'm
you're
done with OpenAI, and then I go to Anthropic.
But then
Like
you
in an
don't have the
agent-
possibility that they're issuing the IDs concurrently.
Right. In an agent, like in a pipeline of agents, one of the agents might be backed by OpenAI and contributing to the request history, and another agent might be backed by Anthropic and contributing to the request history. But you're not like making half a request to OpenAI, making half a request to
Right.
Anthropic, and then finishing them up as part of the same history. That doesn't happen.
Okay.
Right.
We're not like interleaving chat histories or whatever between providers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, but remember the entire point of MCP is to pull tools from different providers and within different scopes.
But
and to make
those
them
aren't
available.
creating. Yeah, but those aren't the things creating the request IDs. That is what I was worried about earlier, but they're not.
And in the scenario where you have local MCP usage, and if we were hosting those with our hosted MCP chat client, we would be the ones creating the request IDs, and I would be more than happy to make those, 64 character, 64 size alphabet if we need to. Like that, sure.
Cryptographically random number generator get string. We made a function for that. All right. Okay. So then my concern is reduced because either I asked the question wrong or I understood the answer wrong.
Yeah. The thing is, like, your concern is reduced, mine is not, because
Fair enough.
my concern was a more general form of your concern.
I believe in the malice thing. I just don't see how it fits in context, so I'm having trouble
That's
Okay,
that's fair.
Levi.
We can
table
take it
thumping on
offline.
that one.
Yeah.
All right.
Accident I was concerned about because it sounded plausible, but
Right.
the clarification says it's probably not. Okay. we're over. Is there anything that you would super duper desperately please like us to talk about before we drop?
Can we glance very quickly over the tool?
The what?
The actual tool that enables all this. The hosted MCP server tool.
Oh, there it is. Okay.
And also the way to trigger the function approvals to generate this with the grabbing functions with approval required AI function.
Does
there's that.
hosted mean remote? Sorry.
Yeah, hosted mean remote, basically.
Can we call it remote?
We already have a bunch of tools that use hosted prefix.
Okay.
Yeah, so the hosted here is referring to the fact that the tool represents something server side. So in this case, it's not actually saying anything about whether the MCP server is standard IO or HTTP. It's just saying that the interaction with it is happening from OpenAI or Anthropic or whoever.
Yeah, I actually
and
understood that, but I understand now how remote is ambiguous because it could imply, yeah.
But yeah, the properties that David has here, and it's largely mapped to just what you can
Yes.
put in on the wire for Anthropic or OpenAI.
Got it.
Yep. The only maybe controversial thing is that there's one property, authorization token, which is as an accelerator for the headers property. Basically, if you call the getter, it will go look into the headers dictionary to see if there's an authorization header with the better prefix, because this is a no out token, and get that. And if you set, if you call the set authorization token, it will set the header authorization with the value better colon space the token, and that's it.
Yeah, it's like a bearer token, presumably.
Yeah.
I feel like in HTTP client, we don't mix the properties this way. Or am I wrong? I know we have accelerators and we have a bucket. Are they interleaved or are they independent?
You mean like for specific headers, like the authorization header?
There's like the typed and the untyped headers on the client, and there's one's under like a sub property. I forget.
Yeah. So a bearer token in HTTP client would be things like HTTP client.default request headers.authorize equals new authorization header open paren bearer comma. the
Right.
token.
But then if you look, is there a dictionary on then default headers that you can then see that same value having been affected, or is there a dictionary for things that don't have names and you don't get to see the values from properties?
So like HTTP content headers is a dictionary.
Yep.
And it also exposes strongly typed properties that provide strong access to some of the members of that dictionary.
Okay.
That's what it is.
We have a guideline that says setting one property shouldn't affect another. And so this is you're saying setting this one changes something in this one, and I'm just asking for prior art for the dictionary based accelerator pattern.
Well, to be clear, I think I don't know that that's what the guideline says. I think the intent of the guideline, regardless of what it says, is that if I were to set authorization token, that shouldn't change like the reference that headers returns. Or if I were to like change the order of the properties, that would cause difference. Change the order that I set the properties, that would cause difference of behaviors. That's why the headers property doesn't have a setter, so that the authorization token can always be just a fast path into a specific entry in headers, and there's no risk of setting them in the wrong order.
Right. Well, I mean, if you set approvals mode and call headers.clear, you've cleared your approval mode, which is not
No,
obvious.
approval mode does not go into headers.
Okay,
But
so
if you call, but if you set authorization token and call headers.clear, it will be cleared. Is that right?
Sorry,
It's a projection.
I was saying
But that's
approval
not
mode,
set-
but I meant authorization token.
If I set authorization token and then I call headers.clear, that will that will clear the authorization token. Yes.
Right.
But that's interacting with the headers collection. That's not interacting with the property.
I think that's okay.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I've done stuff like that.
I'm
It's
just- like I said,
recently even.
I
It's
was
like
just-
a smell-ish.
I was just asking
But
for
yeah.
prior art.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm happy to accept it.
Sometimes
The
I
alternative
prefer.
is like changing authorization token to be get authorization token, set authorization token methods, and I don't know that that really helps anything.
Yeah, a
Yeah,
property
exactly.
just looks nicer.
Well,
I mean,
I guess the other thing you could do, right, is like keep them independent, right? Have like a string field for the authorization token and just always prefer it
yeah, because
or not prefer it. If you set like by the time you actually turn it into the OpenAI or Anthropic type, like just have a policy, but don't have any weird interactions between the setters of two properties.
because
You
the
could.
other complexity or the other thing is property gets are supposed to be O1, right? They're supposed to amortize to as fast as a field read, and
Yeah,
if this
and
is calling
and this
headers
is-
sub authorization
This,
token, it's
this
not.
would effectively.
Well,
U1.
Jeremy's concern is valid in that the getter on authorization token will need to parse out the value from the headers,
The
which
bear.
means stripping off mirror colon, which means there's an allocation associated with the getter. The caveat is that for normal usage patterns, the 99% case is someone is constructing a hosted MCP server tool and they're setting authorization token, and then the Leaf client that's translating this to go onto the wire is getting the authorization token, or they're using the whole header collection. And in that scenario, you're not having to worry about like unnecessary allocation. Kind of the right things just happen. But if someone's not in the loop calling authorization token .get, that would be bad.
Right. It's authorization token, I can't think of why somebody would do it, but if somebody was, instead of writing, for each char C in name, if they wrote for each, or for I 0 until I is name.length, if they were to do that, if name was reading into the headers dictionary, then that for loop is way more expensive than it looks.
The
you can cache
alternative
that.
that
But you
we
wouldn't know you
considered
needed
was
to.
Yeah, the alternative that we considered was basically, I think maybe it was Stefan who said have totally separate backing fields.
Yep.
And then you have a separate method that is get actual authorization token and get actual headers. And the iChat client implementation that's doing the translation doesn't use these properties. They have to use those get actual methods to get the thing that they care about.
Well, do they? Okay, so here's what I'm wondering. Like, I did mention that separately, having different backing fields, but if the authorization token's like the only thing with like a non-auto getter, like, can't we just treat this as basically like a POCO, and like whoever wants this information to construct the Anthropic or the OpenAI options types? I mean, I guess the risk there is they might have different policies over preferring the authorization token over the authorization header if both are set.
Also-
But
Also, Anthropic does not support headers. It only supports authorization token.
I see. So you would need to have the logic to like in at least the Anthropic code to like search for it in the headers, which is kind of
And pull it
annoying.
out. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Are the other servers like, does this correspond to normal HTTP headers for the other servers?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So
So question, what happens if you have an authorization header that doesn't begin with bearer space? What does the authorization token property return?
It should return null.
This is the benefit of just making it a POCO, is it leaves it completely up to whoever is coming up with the final options how to interpret it. It's like, here's the data the customer gave me.
yep, and
Then
then
what you want to do with it.
use the words that are correct to your server.
Yeah.
Then
So
what
like that's the
you should-
upside.
Yeah. So does that mean authorization token isn't necessarily a bearer token? It's whatever the server, however the server wants to interpret that, it's up to them, but it doesn't, it maybe it's an identifier rather than a bearer token. Like, is that a valid interpretation of that field? of that property?
No, it is a better token because we are matching with the prefix. No, what else would
So-
it be?
So we're designing an API in 2026 saying like we believe that the right way to authenticate with MCP servers is bearer tokens, and we expect this API to be like durable.
Oh, so you're saying for future protocols, so future I mean, if in next year is no longer better, what's the standard? Is that what you're saying?
Right. Because bearer tokens are already kind of like discouraged by the industry in general. I know
That's
that
not
a lot of
entirely true.
Mm.
Pure bear tokens, but
pure
yeah,
bear,
that's true. Yeah.
well, and generally what you need is you need like some type of access token that you or a refresh token that you keep getting
Right.
bearer tokens from.
You
But
want to
the
do a lot.
authorization token is not the refresh token, right? It's the access token.
Correct.
So,
Right, and most of these have OAuth flows, which require like browser interaction, which are going to be separate from this. But yeah, I would lean towards keeping this like it's the tool type is as simple as possible, and give some leeway. Like if you want to write client code that is abstract between Anthropic and OpenAI, and they happen to use the same authorization token, then like good for you. Use the authorization token thing, and you know, especially if you pass it via a non-header API to Anthropic. Like
So-
actually, it's really weird if I set the token in the headers dictionary that gets translated to just the authorization token to
So-
the Anthropic API.
So keeping the AI tool as simple as possible means only having the headers dictionary, which is the
Does
simplest
it?
thing
It doesn't make Anthropic simpler because then
no,
it has
makes
to like
it makes
out.
everyone else's life harder.
Yeah.
But it keeps this unambiguous and the simplest definition of the tool. But then every consumer that only has an auth token needs to add the authorization with the bearer colon token, and Anthropic's implementation needs to fish it out of the headers in order to put it into the field.
Do they?
Is
I
this
mean, if they have a
configured once?
POCO, if they have a POCO for the Anthropic implementation, I would just look at the authorization token. If they don't support generic
No,
headers,
I'm
don't look
saying
at
if there's no authorization token field here, there's just a headers dictionary.
it. Yeah.
They have
so
to fish it
question
out.
is
So
So
this
I'm
is the
saying
mobile-
it's simpler to have both.
Yeah.
So-
I think if you have both and they're not related, I think that is incredibly confusing.
By the way,
So-
yeah. Go ahead, Leeway.
I was going to say, is the idea that you configure an instance of this tool once at like app start and then you just kind of
Yes.
keep using it? So if bearer tokens are only valid for a set period of time by default, like say, I don't know, 2 hours, what happens if you have a long-lived chat session? Like, does the
So-
bearer token just eventually expire?
So this isn't necessarily configured once for your app. It's you put this into your collection on each request. If you choose to have it, stored in a static read
Oh.
only, or you choose to whatever, that's on you. The OpenAI and Anthropic wire protocols require you to send the bearer token, or require you to send either the auth token or the headers, depending on which API you're using on every request.
I want
So
to add.
go ahead.
I want to add to that Anthropic started only with Anthropic only supports the authorization token, and for OpenAI they started with the headers, and they have promoted the authorization token to be its own independent field in the POCO.
But you can provide it either in the headers or in
Yes,
that auth
exactly.
token.
Yeah, you can provide either or. But they have provided. What I mean, I think promoting one header to be only one field in the POCO, I don't know, indicates to me that it's a leaning towards doing the things that way. That's what I'm
I'm
trying
just
to say.
curious, David, what happens with OpenAI if you send both the auth token and the headers
sorry.
collection with a different auth token?
Only even if you have both with different tokens, the service returns error 500.
So you can provide auth token or headers, but not both.
Exactly.
I mean, that would probably be the easiest thing to keep forward compatible for now. Just let you configure one.
And it sounds like, so my primary concern was like just these things expiring and then your app just stops working. But it sounds like it sounds like the idea is that the implementation of the tool would do refreshes as necessary.
The consumer would need, it's the consumer that's constructing the tool and putting it into their requests. They would be responsible for whatever refresh of the bearer token they needed to do.
Okay.
So again, I think this should be a POCO, and that like for the Anthropic client, if you set headers, that should be an error. Raise it as early as supported, that it's unsupported.
No. I'm really concerned about that.
Cool.
Because all of this stuff is for across all of MEAI. There are properties that you can set that are a particular endpoint you happen to be talking to at that moment doesn't know about. And in general, the policy has been to just ignore them.
Ignoring's fine. It could still be a POCO though. I think actually leaving it up to the provider to decide how to interpret this makes a lot of sense, especially.
But then the provider's looking at both authorization token and headers sub authorization.
Well, I think if you provide both, it should throw like
For
OpenAI does.
authorization token being that it would be in the original class definition, they shouldn't look in headers for it. You would get that problem if there was a thing commonly in headers that moved to a property later.
So if there's authorization token and headers, where do I put my data?
I think the idea that like you can have a single piece of configuration here that works for both Anthropic and OpenAI is just wrong. So I think
But
you figure out
what
which one works.
So it has to be that.
Okay, maybe it can. Okay, so this is. Would it just work? Okay. I see. Yeah. Okay. Maybe that was the wrong assumption I had, is that the same config wouldn't work, but it would. Or it could.
Does.
If it was only the authorization token, at least today, it could work for both.
And it can work for both with headers. You're just not paying attention to the rest of the headers with Anthropic.
Yeah,
well, if you don't actually need the headers.
Yeah, you could imagine that if there is some kind of special case, like they just special case certain headers and say like this isn't a real header, we know what this means, like we send it across through some other mechanism.
Right.
It's a thing.
So then it's
Extrash.
strange to me that there's two different ways to provide the same information as part of our thing. Because now, as a consumer, where am I supposed to put my information? If I have a header collection that contains an auth token, should I be removing that from my header collection and putting it into the auth token field? And if I'm the iChat client implementation, I need to look at both authorization token, and if that's null, then look in the headers collection to see, and what's the priority order between them.
All right, I'm coming around. So you said you like
gets weird,
headers only. Steven, headers only is fine with you?
I'm saying either headers only or authorization token that's an accelerator into headers. I'm fine with either of those. I struggle with anything beyond those.
The other thing that's like a little weird, though I'm guessing this might show up elsewhere, is like technically headers aren't one-to-one key value. It's like one-to-many. I don't know if we care about that.
Is that true for auth token?
Not for auth token, just headers in general. Like looking at the dictionary of string to string, like more correct
you
would
meant
be
like
string to string
array, or
yeah.
Yeah, that's somebody. Yeah, the commas themselves.
Yeah, like set cookie is really the only thing that I've ever seen people have multiple headers for.
Yeah,
It's true, but people might want that.
Can't they just
you put
use
string values?
they can put two values together in their own string concat, right?
For cookies, probably.
If they know
It's
how to do
different
it.
on the wire. It does change, like if it's multiple headers versus a single concatenated header, it's different data that you send, but a lot of servers will treat that the same.
Are there any HTTP headers that require having separate lines in the HTTP headers?
Like repeating the
require it.
header key.
Like-
I don't think
Like
so.
user agent A /r/n user agent B versus user agent A comma B, or user agent A semicolon B, or whatever. Like, are there any that require it to be on two
Most
different
servers, I think, would reject that.
Would reject what?
I think
If you
set
see
cookie.
multiple headers.
No, most allow
Set
it,
cookie
right?
only
Like,
allows a single name and a single value.
single
so-
name per cookie, right? But you can have multiple set cookie headers.
Right.
Response headers, yeah.
That's true.
Same with request headers.
The client wouldn't.
Yeah.
And I don't remember how the client sends cookies.
But
Yeah,
for
it's
whatever
more
we're
about
talking-
repeating the header name, and then like that's a thing you can do, but I don't know if it's actually required for anything. Usually, headers that can accept multiple values have a way to like concatenate that in a single value.
The client cookie, they're allowed to merge them all into one header.
And they
I mean,
do
the other
examples.
option is to have it not be a dictionary. It could be a list of key value pairs.
Right, but that's
So
kind of
doesn't this
annoying.
type need to be thread safe if we're talking about updating it asynchronously in the background?
Who's updating it asynchronously in the background?
If you have a refresh token and say 2 hours elapses and you're like, oh, I need to update the access token that I have on my tool definition, like, don't you go to this original object and insert the new value into the dictionary or replace the value? Or
Yes,
do you make
but
a
not
new
wh-
tool
but
object?
not while it's in use,
How do you know if it's in use?
because your response ended.
Aren't some of the middlesware running asynchronously?
Not asynchronously fire and forget.
This seems like something that would benefit from having a sample available.
Every interaction with your pipeline is non-fire and forget. If there's fire and forget stuff happening, that's a bug. It's either I make a request and a non-streaming request, I get back a task, the task completes, all work is done. Or it's I make a request, I get back an async enumerable, I enumerate it, the enumeration ends, all work is done.
Similar to like HTTP context, right? Like the only thread safe API there is the port.
Yeah, and it's a
Well,
bug
when-
if you use the HTTP context in a fire and forget manner.
But when you say the work is done, you mean like we could still be in the middle of a tool call, right? Like the server may have told us, I need you to invoke this tool locally. We invoke the tool and then we send the data back to the server. Like the bearer token
But-
could have changed at that point, right?
Sure, but between those two, those are two completely independent calls. There's nothing on the server that is still active. There's
Right.
nothing on the client that's still active. There's might be, data in a database, but between those two calls, it's totally fine for me to change the tool and make the request again.
Yeah, but what I'm getting at is like on the client side, if on the client side I see, okay, I've received a request to run this tool from the server. I'm now running the tool locally. Maybe the local tool invocation is async, so I'm awaiting that. How do I know that during that await, it's safe for me to update the bearer token? Like, how do I interleave this on the client side to make sure that I'm not stomping on any data structures that are not thread safe?
So I just want to make sure I understand. You're saying I, the client, make a single request, but one of my middleware components, as part of my request, is going back and forth with the server, like the function invoking chat client. And this tool is in the mix, and my bearer token changes during that all up request.
Correct.
Is that right? Yeah, you'll get an exception if you just get an access denied. You're not updating the bearer token in that situation.
But given that some of these sessions could be relatively long-lived, like, doesn't that kind of defeat the utility of our API?
No, the number of the number of back and forths that happen as part of that are typically relatively limited in terms of the number of round trips that happen as part of function invocation. And you can set a limit on it if you don't like it, so that it comes back to you at some point at some reasonable interval. I can say I only want 3 round trips to the server max as part of my function invocation loop. You could also insert, if you want to, you can also insert your own middleware at the end of the pipeline that's changing the value of the bearer token or refreshing the value of the bearer token completely non-concurrent with anything else that's happening in the pipeline, so that the right stuff gets put onto the wire. And it could have its own, it's refreshing it once an hour or something. It has non-concurrent access to this tool in that pipeline.
Oh, so maybe that would be the right way to do this then, just because it stays self-contained and you don't really have to worry about interleaving. Because here I'm not concerned about malice, I'm just concerned about your app stops working unexpectedly.
Yeah, if you wanted to, you could do it by inserting. I think very few people will want to. I think they would accept if I happen to have that situation happen once every 2 hours, I get an error, which I'm already used to, and I reissue the request. But if someone wanted to be doing it proactively, Either they would do it by inserting additional middleware after the function invoking chat client, or they would use a function invoking chat client where they've configured some of the like hooks that they have to sort of insert additional calls as part of the iteration.
That all sounds good.
Fair enough. And chat asks basically a proxy question. It says they need one different auth or one auth header for their gateway and then a different one to go to the specific backend. And how would you do that with this?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question. Could you repeat it, Jeremy?
So it seems like they have a local gateway that they're routing MCP things through, and they need to authorize to the gateway and then to the MCP server beyond. So it says we have an auth header for our backend gateway, then a different auth header for the specific MCP we're talking to.
So it only work with OpenAI, right? Because it's probably going to have to be separate headers or some custom logic.
Right.
I guess if it
Yeah,
goes to your gateway first, the gateway might be able to like extract part of the bearer token. Like, you know, you
but
could,
I guess my question would be
Manual.
forget all this stuff. How are they doing it with OpenAI directly today?
yeah.
Fair enough.
Oh, and I dropped in chat. I had a conversation GPT 5.2, and it seems like set cookie, the one thing we could think of, is really the only common header that gets like repeated, and that's only a response header. I would be fine with only expose an iDictionary of string to string, but I don't know how breaking it would be to like delete the authorization token thing if we already shipped it.
Well, I haven't seen an answer yet. But as Stefan commented, it would possibly just work with setting the authorization token value in the payload and then using bearer token to your gateway if the gateway ate the bearer token header and sent the authorization token payload member onto the OpenAI backend. But
And to be clear, this is for the token OpenAI is going to use to pass to your MCP server or potentially your gateway to the MCP server, I think.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
okay, well, I mean, we certainly didn't finish, so assuming you want to bring it back, I'll mark it needs work just because we didn't finish. And if you're saying you have a Thursday deadline, so what we talked about today is what ships, then I can call it approved.
I don't know what. Sorry, was that a question for me?
Are you planning on coming back with the things we didn't talk about?
Well, I mean, I'm definitely could come back if
Okay.
folks are.
Well, you'd
willing
said something
to.
to me about Thursday, so if this was
Yeah.
on Thursday, all of this goes public with no experimental attributes, then there's no point in marking it needs work because you're shipping what you got. But if there's still room to discuss things, then I'm going to call it needs work. Just because we ran out of time.
Yeah, it feels like there might be one or two things here we just take offline over the next 48 hours. So I think needs work is all right.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. The notes that I have thus far. Function approval response content reason moved to a constructor parameter. No, not that one. Over here. And I defaulted it because that's what you said to do. We renamed invocation required to informational only and got rid of function approval request content CTOR request ID because it's just function call ID.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for educating me on how none of the words meant what I thought they meant.
Cool.
I do feel like I was a big holdup on the execution required versus informational only, but
With our powers combined, we managed to waste almost an hour and a half. No, I'm sorry.
so. All right. Yeah, I'm tired and I need lunch. So I'll move on to thanks everybody who gave comments the whole time, and especially if you stayed with us for the extra 42 minutes of overrun, and it'll overrun even more because we'll pick it up next session. I opened in Spanish, so until then, adios. Oh, .NET time, .NET channel. Yeah, words. I'm tired. Bye, everybody.